Well, it's important for congregations to tell their stories because we always have new folks coming in that don't know them.
It's explaining what's happening, and then it's also talking about what can happen in the future and the good things that we can all aspire to.
As we begin this final chapter of Gil's presentation, the subject is how a leader can help give a better story.
One of the things that you and I need to be doing in our congregations is to be able to identify what is the power of the story of our church and to help people tell that story, and then in telling the story, live it. And I got to tell you that my experience over the past 20-some years of being a full-time consultant is that I have worked with too many congregations that have weak stories. Too many congregations that have depleted stories. Too many congregations that tell their story, and when they come to the strength of their congregation and the real potential of the congregation, they're talking about 30, 40, and 50 years ago. Now, what I'd like you to do, friends, is just work with me here for a little bit, a little experiment. What I'd like you to do is on a piece of paper, if you have a piece of paper there, I would like you to write down the list of adjectives, adverbs, or descriptors that you would use to explain yourself as a person to me. If you wanted me to know what kind of a person you are, what are the 10 adjectives, adverbs, or descriptors that you would use to explain yourself? So if you would, take a minute and go ahead and make your list. Okay, now your list may not be complete. That's okay, wherever you are on your list. What I'd like you to do next is, alongside of that list, I would like you to make another list. And this time I would like you to list the 10 adjectives, adverbs, or descriptors that you would use to describe yourself as a person to me. If that list was written by your mother. Okay, go ahead. Now, you've got two lists. Hopefully, they're somewhat similar since they're both describing the same person. That's one of the things we're hoping for here. But the difference that I want us to pay attention to for the moment is not the list, but your response. When I asked you to make the second list, the list of adjectives that were written by your mother, what was the first thing you heard in this room? Laughter. And groans, thanks very much. But laughter. Now, when you were working on the first list, the room was silent. Did you hear it? Or I guess I should say, did you not hear it? What do you think you look like as a group in that first list? For someone like me standing here looking at the group, working on that task, what do you think the group looked like? Oh, you were serious. Oh, man, you were really invested in this. I got to get this list right. What if Rendle makes us stand up and read it? I want to make sure I got it right, But you weren't the same way when we got to the second list. You started out with laughter. There were smiles while you were working on it. Now, obviously, it was thoughtful in both lists, but it was different. What's going on there? Why do you think that is? Let me go right to the heart of it. Iris Murdoch talks about the fact. Murdoch was a psychiatrist, psychologist, and a writer. She talks about the fact that we always describe ourselves down the safe middle. That first time that you were writing that list, you were looking for adjectives that were accurate. Yeah, you were probably trying to play fair. I could really live with these adjectives, but they were safe. And the reason we always describe ourselves down the safe middle is because we don't want to, kind of include the negative stuff that we know about ourselves, because if we put the negative stuff on the list, we actually have to do something about it. And worse yet, we don't really want to put our gifts and our skills on that list, because if we name our gifts, we actually have to use them. And so what we do is we provide a description of ourselves down the safe middle. It really is us, but it's also something that we can live with very, very comfortably. Our mothers are not so constrained. Our mothers are willing to talk about the bigger us. They're willing to talk about, the stuff that we struggle with. They're willing to talk about the stuff that they're actually very proud of what we can do. And part of what Murdoch says is that maturity is about being able to expand that list, to make it wider. Friends, congregations very, very naturally think of themselves and describe themselves down the safe middle. Their story tends to live in a very safe middle, where they don't really expose the stuff that they have to wrestle with, and they certainly don't want to have to name their gifts. Try this exercise sometime with people in your congregation and take safe words away from them, such as warm and friendly. And watch how people will struggle. A lot of us are in congregations whose stories are much too safe. And because they're so safe, people can live comfortably. And because they can live comfortably, they don't feel that they have anything at risk, and therefore don't extend. There's this conversation that goes on in terms of understanding leadership and understanding the way that human behavior is. And the question is, do our stories determine how we behave, or does our behavior determine our stories? By being able to tell a bolder story invites us to be bolder and to be more of who we have been called to be. A couple of examples. One of my favorite examples of all time is working with a congregation that was an urban congregation. It was a high-risk congregation. It was part of its community, and it was working hard to provide for the needs that were in the community, so it was involved with food programs, shelter programs, advocacy programs. It was in a position where it was located in a section of the city that was being regentrified. And so all the neighbors were invested in getting the people out of the neighborhood that this congregation was invested in bringing in so that they could meet the needs. The city actually tried to shut them down. I mean, talk about, kind of a gutsy congregation. The city's Department of License and Inspection came in at the behest of some of the neighborhood council that was trying to regentrify, and asked if they could inspect the building, and then came back saying, well, you don't meet the code in the lower level where you have Sunday school, therefore you can no longer have Sunday school. Well, that's pretty potent stuff for a congregation to have to deal with when the city tells you that. So they talked about that for a while back at the church, and they said what we need to do is we need to send one of our representatives over to the License and Inspection Department. And so that person went over and said, boy, are we glad you came to inspect our building. We never knew that. And we would never want to put our children in jeopardy. So could you please give us a copy of the code that you were working with, and we will give you the name of every other church in the city that has the same problem. So we were doing some work with them, and as a part of it, I asked one of my favorite questions. We had the leadership off on retreat. We had a Friday night, all day Saturday. We were going to work. By Saturday morning, I asked them, find the part of the biblical story that you're living and tell me why. This congregation came back and they said, our story in the Bible is in Isaiah, where you have that phrase, you shall mount up with wings as eagles. They said, that's who we think we are called to be. But the reason it's our story is because we have too many incidents when we have chickened out. They left that retreat with the logo of a flying chicken. Really. All right. Now, as soon as I said that, what did you hear in the room? Laughter. All these leaders went back to their congregation, and people in the church say, what'd you do over your retreat? Well, we figured out we're flying chickens. And they actually had drawings of flying chickens that they put up around the church. Luckily, they kept it off the front of their worship bulletin. I was proud of them for that. But for about 2 years, every time they came up to a difficult decision at the board, somebody on the board would say, wait, this is where we're supposed to soar. We cannot chicken out. Do you hear the power of that? To find your story and to find a bold story changes who you are.
So how does this bolder story happen? As you might imagine, Gil has a few suggestions.
And the way you give the people a better story to live is to challenge the story that they currently have. This isn't about going home and just telling a story that might be a little bit more interesting than others. This is going home and listening closely to the story that's already there and challenging it because it's not enough. One of the things that I do all the time as a consultant, I get invited into congregations, and when I go into the congregation, I have to learn that congregation as quickly as I can. And so I often do a lot of interviews. I gather data. I invite people to give me their church histories, a lot of other reports that really help me. Because what I need to do, I need to learn as fast as I can in order to be part of this congregation and help them. And so this comes very close to my favorite definition of a consultant. And that is, a consultant is someone who borrows your watch to tell you what time it is. And so I go into the congregation and I say, now, well, friends, tell me what's going on here. And they all tell me, and I take all these notes. And then I go back to my office and I try to work on it a bit, and I write up a report, and I go back and I say, well, friends, let me tell you what's going on here. But when I do it, what I give back is going to be their story with my challenge. When I give it back, I'm going to give it back and say, friends, this is the way you tell your story, but this is also what you're not talking about. When I give it back, I'm going to say to people, this is what you told me about what's going on here. And you can't do some things about all of it, but boy, here's the worthwhile piece for you to work on that's going to make a difference. And I give them a story that's different than what they gave me. A congregation that will tell me that they have a long, lustrous history, and they are amazingly proud of their music program. And I report back to them the excellence of their music program and how it fits at least 20% of their congregation. And then I'll begin to talk about the people who talk to me about how sterile the music was in their life when they came to worship. And I'll say, who are you doing ministry with? And so the story that I give back will be the data that they've given to me, but in a way that they now have to wrestle. You all do it. One of the things that we need to learn how to do is simply reflect back and describe. One of the tools of leadership is learning how to be descriptive. Well, let me tell you that little story, and then we'll try to come back to it in another way. This is one of the tasks of leadership when we're beginning to take a look at a diverse environment where there are so many differences. We have to be very careful to learn how to be descriptive rather than evaluative. And the story that I want to tell you is a story about my driving. You know, I'm driving. If I'm driving in my car and I'm driving at 50 or 55 miles an hour and I'm driving through a residential area that's posted at 25 miles an hour and there are children running around playing there and my wife is with me, she can choose either to be descriptive or evaluative. And so if she's descriptive, she's going to turn to me and she's going to say, Gil, you're driving awfully fast here. This is a residential area. Look at the children. I feel very upset. Now, I'm not real happy to receive that, but it's a really good description. And when somebody gives you a description, the conversation continues. We negotiate. Okay? We don't just leave it there. We try to do something about it. And so I say to her, well, you know, you're right. I better slow down. Or I might say to her, you're right, but we're late. Help me watch for kids. Right? But the conversation continues. We figure out how we're going to do this. Now, okay, friends, if I'm driving 55 miles an hour in a residential area and my wife is with me and she decides not to be descriptive, but she decides to be evaluative, she's going to turn to me and she's going to say, Gil, you are really a lousy driver. That is clearly an evaluation. When somebody gives you an evaluation, the conversation does not continue. You don't negotiate. I have no options. I must speed up. Right? Why? Why does it work that way? Part of what's going on, friends, is that different kinds of information get processed differently in our brains. And what we now know about the physiology of our brains is that the least developed part of our brain, sometimes known as the reptilian core, is the part of the brain that processes most information first, always looking for anything that's a threat. And an evaluation is always perceived as a threat. And what's in that reptilian core is the simple fight-flight switch. Have you heard about that? Somebody threatens you, and either you're going to go at the threat and try to conquer it, or else you're going to try to flee and run away from it. Either I'm going to argue with my wife all the rest of the way to wherever we're going, or else we're going to stop talking to each other until we get there. Have you been there? So one of the things that we need to learn how to do is that when we listen to the story of our congregations, we have to challenge it. And the way we challenge it is not by telling people they have a bad story, not by telling them that they're stuck in the old golden years of King David and would you please grow up and stop talking about that and sing something besides the 20 hymns that you like. That's evaluative. It stops the conversation. What we do when we challenge the story is simply describe. We simply describe what we're seeing. I worked with one congregation. They really were in a place where they had been depleting a lot of their resources. We took a look at their membership graph and their average attendance graph, and it had been on steady decline. And the reason they wanted to talk with me was to talk about what could they do to turn things around. Well, a half hour into the conversation, they were telling me how great the church was and how pleased they were and how everything was going great. I simply had to describe the chart that they were looking at. And then you just give it back to people. Why is it that you've got a graph like this and you're talking about how bright and rosy your future is? Tell them what you're seeing and ask them to stay in the conversation with you. Our power as leaders is that we have the power of agenda. We have some power in being able to direct what people talk about. Did I mention the management question about how many candles we have for Christmas Eve? My first church liked that conversation. And we would start that conversation in September. At the board meeting, we would talk about how many candles we have for the Christmas Eve candlelight service. And after about 20 minutes, we would decide it would be a good idea to have somebody count them. So we would identify someone and commission them to count the candles. Now, they would bring that back in October as a report. In October, we would spend 20 minutes talking about whether or not we thought that was enough candles. And we would talk about how many do we think we have on Christmas Eve and how many do you remember and when's the last time we did have to set up extra chairs, and we would have that conversation. And then we would decide we don't have enough candles. So we would commission somebody to find out who sells candles. And they would bring that back as a November. Have you heard? Okay. One of the reasons congregations do that is known as work avoidance. That is simple, straightforward, linear planning, problem solving. We know how to do it. It's designed to get us to the action as quickly as possible, and we spend 4 months on it because if we don't, then we have to go talk about something more important. And that's much more frightening. We have the power of agenda as a leader to be able to say that if we're worried about the candles, would you please count them? And if you don't think there's enough, buy some. Thank you very much. I think it would be more important and more helpful for us to talk about this. And then we begin to talk about who are we? And what has God called us to do? And who is our neighbor? And what is the story of our congregation that would help us to know that? Our task, friends, is not to go home with solutions. Our task is not to go home with new programs. Our task is not to go home. It's not to go home with answers. It's to go home with some really good questions about who we are and what our story is. And when you do that, friends, please stay away from the facts. Facts will ruin a good story every single time. That what is powerful is in the telling itself. A Jewish teaching story. Truth, naked and cold, had been turned away from every door in the village. Her nakedness frightened the people. When Parable found her, she was huddled in a corner, shivering and hungry. Taking pity on her, Parable gathered her up and took her home. There she dressed Truth in story, warmed her and sent her out again. Clothed in story, Truth knocked again at the villager's door and was readily welcomed into the people's houses. They invited her to eat at their table and warm herself by their fire. Thank you for being part of UU University. You are giving a part of yourself to form community and to be faithful. Thanks for your attention through all this. Friends, in all of this, I hope you will go home and stop solving problems.